Hey everybody, this is John with another installment of Think Culture, and we're back from our unintentional hiatus, which was long and hard and desolate, full of despair. But now we're back together again, and our hopes are being fulfilled, our yearnings satisfied, our dreams realized, and we're ready to carry on together. um, I won't bore you with the details of what's been going on or anything, but so we'll just get right into it. Talk about some of the things that I've been thinking about recently. I have kids, obviously, so I watch like Disney movies and stuff, especially with my older son, and they're garbage. It's just totally saturated with like progressive propaganda. And we went back and I tried to watch some of the stuff from when I was a kid. I thought maybe that would be better and it would be less like that. But basically, it's the same. And I mean, I grew up as a kind of default liberal. And when I sort of came of age and began thinking seriously about politics and stuff like that, I inclined kind of naturally to the left. I think due basically to kind of a set of moral prejudices. And so then you could ask yourself, how is it that I came to acquire these moral prejudices? And you look at all these movies that I grew up watching, all these TV shows and stuff, and you notice that it's just like endless, liberal platitudes, moral cliches. And so I think that basically, my entire generation was sort of blue-pilled by this apparatus, and one of the things that's different is that the newer stuff really lacks the kind of originality. It lacks the storytelling of sort of the previous generation of Disney stuff. And I think that what's happening is sort of this Toynbee thing, where we had a creative minority that was engaged in kind of the creation of a new moral universe, a moral language, engaged in a kind of transvaluation of all values. And now they've sort of degenerated into a dominant minority. They no longer have the kind of creative power. They no longer are capable of stimulating kind of mimetic desire on behalf of their audience, on behalf of the masses. That's why I think all these movies are tanking and stuff. But so there's a kind of desperation where they're just sort of browbeating you with what used to be somewhat subtle. Now it's become really overtly didactic. Like the movie now is nothing, and this isn't just Disney. It's nothing other than just like cut and paste a whole bunch of just cut and paste a platitudinous slurry of pablum. Just script after script after script after script. They're all identical. There's always been some sort of uniformity, which is what I mean by that they're all these sort of liberal platitudes, and they're establishing these moral prejudices. They're inculcating in people sort of moral reflexes. And you notice that the stories, even traditionally or whatever, they're all the same sort of like anti-culture stories, basically. They're death works in which you have this marginalized, excluded other who is, left out of society, who, the evil paternal authority or the laws or a society which is harsh and restrictive or whatever. They think that you're not good enough, you're small, you're weak, you're a freak, whatever. And it turns out that they're actually evil and crappy and they shouldn't have excluded you and you're great and it was so mean and they're bullies, right? And that's like every one of these stories in a nutshell. Even when you're watching like Hercules or something, you see this constant oh yeah, you're a weirdo, we don't like you, whatever. You watch Tarzan and you hear this constant refrain of stuff like, why are you so afraid of people that are different? It's just endless. But now it's much more overt, the didacticism. And so I think that indicates that, they're not creative anymore. Their energies are spent, and they can't do the job anymore of fashioning the moral universe for the next generation. Hopefully, but they sure try. And this is what's important, right? Obviously, some conservatives are increasingly like understanding that the culture stuff matters. They need to understand that it's all that matters. I mean, genuinely, it's all that matters. But even insofar as they think that it matters, they fail to adequately understand the phenomenon. And I think that's because they've cut themselves off from the intellectual resources necessary to grappling with it. Like I heard recently somebody say, he was like, it's not just Hollywood, it's also kind of like the media, even like music. And, I heard this and I'm like, the culture industry. What you're talking about is the culture industry. And I'm just thinking, like, if you want to understand what is happening, even in the language of stuff like the cathedral, what I hear in that is I have lost connection with the tradition necessary to fully understand and grapple with the problems that confront us. Because really, what you're talking about is the culture industry. You've called it something else because you're not reading the Frankfurt School. And to me, these are the guys that most adeptly, right, most seriously, most extensively analyzed the phenomenon of the culture industry, thought about what it does, what its purpose is, and how to capture it, right? Ultimately, they did capture it. And so to me, if you want to understand what's happening or how this works, you need to return to people like Horkheimer and Adorno, right? You need to be reading The Dialectic of Enlightenment in the culture industry. You need to be reading Marcuse and One Dimensional Man. You need to be reading stuff like Gramsci, right? To understand the idea of cultural hegemony and how important that is. How sort of mental and cognitive and cultural revolutions precede political revolutions. The manufacture of human souls is the key issue. Right? Some conservatives also seem to think like, okay, well, if we understand that this is where the issue is, let's abolish it. And I'm like, that's a mistake. You can't abolish it. Every regime has to have institutions, apparatuses that are involved in the creation of human souls, that do create a moral universe, right? Otherwise, you don't have people. That's what it means to be a person. Like, everyone is brainwashed. Everyone's always going to be brainwashed. Get over it. Right. You'll notice that the people who really understood that phenomenon, they didn't abolish it. They took it over. So there's this question that I think is an important one, which is like, how is it that we're looking at this phenomenon and we're saying that it's creating, certain types of people, it's inculcating certain norms, certain values, certain moral prejudices, certain sort of moral reflexes, right? And the people who best understood that phenomenon and how that works, how this is kind of a coercive apparatus for social control, right? And for creating a certain type of person, which, as we see like in Plato's Republic, when you create certain types of people, certain types of souls, that leads to a different type of regime, right? Plato already apprehends this as the important phenomenon. The type of soul that is being produced in a given society, that determines the regime that exists. You create, democratic souls start to be produced from out of oligarchic souls in whatever way. And then you have a democratic regime once you get enough people with these democratic souls. And so if you want to control things politically, if you want to determine sort of the social destiny of a people, you take control over the production of their souls. You take control of the culture industry. And that's what they did, right? And that's why you can look at them and you're like, they have the keenest insight into this phenomenon that I am struggling against, and yet it's their values that inhabit the culture industry that that is the problem, right? That's because they subverted and took these institutions over. They didn't destroy them. Because you can't destroy them. They cannot be destroyed. This is just a vital function for any kind of human social organization. And so, you could ask a further question like, okay, so how exactly did this work? And I think that the story about post-World War II is pretty good. And if you're interested in that, you could read Paul Gottfried. I think primarily is in my mind sort of the best on this stuff. And he wrote like The Strange Death of Marxism and his new anti-fascist book and stuff like that. But the story there is something like after World War II, basically we sent people into Germany to work with sociologists and psychologists and stuff like that in order to establish a kind of educational framework, the goal of which was to transform the souls of German citizens, to beat out of them, in a kind of soft way, all of their pre-existing moral prejudices, all of their their authoritarian tendencies, their concern for tradition and patriarchy and whatever. And so we started to develop this kind of apparatus of social control, which was a psyop. It's explicitly a psyop, right? It's an operation designed to transform the psychology of German people. And so this is established, and a lot of these people come back to America. They take up residence here in our Ivy Leagues and stuff. They start working with like the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. They develop stuff like in studies on prejudice, right? They wrote the authoritarian personality. They developed the F scale, a scale for determining how fascist you are based on different values and beliefs and things like that. And basically it's like, if you think that the traditional family structure is good, that suggests to us that you're a fascist. If you think that you should listen to your father, that suggests you're a fascist. If you think that the way things have been traditionally done is likely to be a good way things are done, then that means you're probably a fascist. So they develop this F scale in the authoritarian personality, and it actually gets implemented in like civil service exams and stuff like that. So and even outside of that, it seeps into like pedagogical programs and things like that. It seeps into the culture. We still see a continuation of the same sort of thing today. When when the American Psychology Association determines that traditional masculinity is psychopathological, this is a continuation of that same project. Ever since then, studies the authoritarian personalities like 1952, something like that. Ever since then, there's been this continuous project. This is in the era of denazification. All of this sort of came about under the umbrella of denazification, a psyop, which makes the Kanye stuff more interesting, by the way. But ever since then, we have seen a continuation of the same project, which is like conservatism is a psychopathology. Traditionalism is a psychopathology. Traditional masculinity is a psychopathology. They'll say like liberals and conservatives, studies show, have different values. And guess what? Liberals have the good ones and conservatives have the bad ones. The people who are inclined to like totalitarian evil, we've determined that it has to do with these traits that are more common in conservatives. The conservative mind is constantly under assault by all of these institutions, being considered psychopathological, being considered dumb, like conservatives have lower IQs or whatever, stuff like that. Or in TV and movies, stuff like that. Again, conservatives are always represented as repressive, evil, bigot, stupid, unwilling to change, blah, 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 blah. Right? This is constant messaging in the culture. And the contention here would be that this sort of thing basically evolves out of World War II and out of attempts at denazification. So like the Frankfurt School came over, some of them ended up going back, but they changed higher education altogether, right? And they changed the government through their work with the OSS. They had an impact on things like psyops that are performed by the CIA and stuff. Marcuse stayed here and became a huge symbol of the sort of new left and things like that. But so that's like one story about what has happened and how they managed to accomplish this. They do that, so this happens on the backs of this analysis of the culture industry and stuff like that, right? So they have this analysis. It gets integrated into a kind of program of denazification, a generalized educational psyop that comes back to America, and so then we sort of inadvertently psyop ourselves too. And this whole denazification program and the integration with the levers of power that occurs has to do with, like, we've identified the culture industry, we've identified these institutions that are engaged in creating Nazis or whatever, creating fascists, creating authoritarians. And so we're going to take over these institutions and we're going to change them in such a way that now they don't produce authoritarians, they don't produce fascists, they produce woke libtards. Basically, it winds up being the consequence of that. I think that this is a pretty good narrative, like that there's a lot of insight to this and it has a lot to do with what has happened. To me, it doesn't capture everything because I'm interested more in the metaphysics of decline, the metaphysics of the progressive left as being a kind of death drive, a drive toward sameness, homogeneity, universality, individuality and universality being sort of two sides of the same thing. So to me, I'm more interested in that kind of stuff, but I think this is a pretty good narrative, and yeah, you can refer to Paul Gottfried and stuff if you're interested in that. But the point is, they were able to, they looked at a culture industry in which like the hero archetype is John Wayne or Humphrey Bogart or something, right? Actual masculine men, traditional authoritarian high F skill value masculine men. So they're looking at the culture industry and they're accusing it of manufacturing a type of psychology that they think is psychopathological. And they were able to, on the strength of the insights that they gained from this analysis, actually go into the system and totally change it. Now we're looking at it, and the hero archetype is nothing remotely like a John Wayne. It's like a disabled trans black girl who is, who white bigots want to murder or something like that, right? That's like more the sort of archetype of a hero in today's society. It's like the gay in the closet who's marginalized and who's oppressed by a society that doesn't want to allow them to be true to their inner identity and all this kind of stuff. It's been totally transformed. And you can think about this also in terms of things like Nietzsche, his conversation about like the slave revolt, right? Like in ancient Athens, right? The hero archetype is Achilles. Plato in the Republic wants to exchange the Achilles archetype for a Socrates, because he thinks that the Achilles archetype is sort of without virtue. The Socrates archetype is more virtuous, right? And then we get Jesus, and we go through all these transformations. But when you're looking at something like representations of heroic masculinity as John Wayne, and then it's transformed into whatever. I don't know. What you're watching is the apparatus for the construction of human souls has totally changed course, right? But the structure is exactly the same. If you want to understand the structure and how to engage with it, you need to be reading things like the Frankfurt School. Okay, you need to be reading critical theory, Western Marxism more broadly. That's what you need to be doing. You can also see this, for example, in horror movies, which is I've become really interested in. Uh, I used to think that they were like lame, and I was like, "Oh, you think you're scaring me or whatever?" I'm not scared. Whereas, later I came to think that really the unconscious of modern society is sort of laid bare in the horror film in a way that no other genre can do, because it plays with desire and anxieties and fantasy and in a way that is more in keeping with the structure of the unconscious. It's also just like bigger. Like the palette is much broader when you're talking about, like, you can have a horror movie that has comedic elements, dramatic elements, tragic elements, you know, anything can be included in a horror movie and it's still a horror movie. But if you include horror in anything else, now it's a horror movie, right? So you can do literally anything within the context of a horror movie, which I think also means that it has the most potential as a genre. But so that makes it a particularly good, I think, genre to look at to try to understand how the human mind has been reconfigured during this period. So if you look like in the 50s and 60s, you're looking at horror movies, you're seeing stuff like Creature from the Black Lagoon. What is Creature from the Black Lagoon? There is a foreign threat out there, right? We have our society, we have an us and a them, right? Or an us and an it. There's a kind of foreign intrusion that threatens to overwhelm us that we need to keep out, right? We establish our kind of immune defenses along the borders of society in order to keep out this kind of alien threat, right? To protect the particularity of our community, right? The outside is evil. This is xenophobic in a sense, right? Then you move into kind of the next generation, you start to get like slasher films, in which case what is happening? You're saying, okay, we have the suburbs, it's safe, we have our enclosed little community. We've managed to stave off all the terrors of the world, all the terrors of nature. We're in control. We've established a kind of safe enclave for ourselves. But there is this fear lurking, which is maybe actually the threat is inside. Maybe there's a persistent threat within our community. Maybe there's something wrong with this enclave, with this safe haven we've established for ourselves. And so there starts to be a kind of skepticism about our own community, our escape, our ability to really get away from the terror of the real. Okay? And then you move on to the sort of next iteration, and then what happens? You get this sort of psychologized idea of a villain, in which now it's like we can't trust our perceptions. Someone, like, they're maybe schizophrenic or they have dissociative identity disorder. You thought this stuff was happening with this person, but actually it wasn't happening. You were seeing something, or blah 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 blah, right? So then there's this like epistemological crisis. How do I know what's a threat and what isn't? Right? How can I be sure? How can I be sure that I'm safe, or that I'm in danger, or that I'm good or bad, or they're good or bad? Maybe my suburb is a fantasy. Maybe it's an illusion. Maybe, blah, blah, blah. Then you get on to this sort of next phase that we're currently in. And what happens in this phase, now it's no longer this kind of epistemic problem where you're like, I can't identify good and bad anymore. Now you return to being able to identify good and bad, but you're bad. Your society is bad. Your suburb is bad. Your community is bad. Now we've moved all the way from xenophobia to xenophilia and a kind of ethnomasochism, in which it's like, now the premise of the horror movie is more something like, we have our community, everything seems like it's going okay, blah, blah, blah. But then the protagonist starts to realize, actually we're monsters, actually we're evil. Actually, all of our suburban paradise is built on the backs of black people in hamster wheels that are generating electricity for us, or something like that. Like, we're engaged in some kind of monstrosity. We're the brutal evil ones. And the protagonist's realization that in terms of the us and them, it's the us that is terrible. right? Them is good. Them is the victim, right? Now the creature from the Black Lagoon, he's actually a good guy, and we're the monsters who are hunting and terrorizing him and his family or whatever. And so I think that, like, in this evolution you see in horror movies, what you're looking at is you're looking at a total transformation in the nature of human consciousness. They have been effective. They did seize the culture industry. They have succeeded in producing a new kind of human being, a kind of human being whose fears, whose anxieties, whose desires have been totally reconfigured such that now they are sort of self-hating. They hate their particularity, right? We want to end our particularity and drown ourselves in the universal, basically. Our difference is produced through the exclusion of others, and exclusion is always coercive, it's always hostile, it's always evil. And that's the way they start to think about it, right? And so, like, to me, in terms of this metaphysical thing, what that means is, like, the universal is being prioritized over the particular. Abandon the particular. Particularity means separation. It means difference. It means separation. It means exclusions. It means us and them. We're rejecting that whole system now. Everything particular has got to die. It's got to be drowned in the universal so that we can just have homogeneous sameness everywhere, right? And that's ultimately the goal metaphysically of the left, and you can see it in the content of films like this. And you can see very clearly that the nature of the unconscious of a 1950s American is radically different than the nature of the unconscious of 2010s, 2020s American. And that corresponds necessarily, again, to dramatic differences in the way society is run, in our institutions, in our philosophy. So, yeah. The culture is very important. You need to, don't simply react to culture, but think culture.